Marion, I'm sure, will be a familiar face to some of you here today. She's a reader in Welsh history and history at Cardiff University. She's particularly interested in the relationships between Welsh culture, politics and religion, as well as in Wales's place in Georgian and Victorian Europe and the British Empire. The echoes of the French Revolution of 1789 in Wales, the history of the Welsh language, and knowledge transfer via translation are her foci, or the foci of her research, and today she will be listening and searching for echoes of Price's ideas and influence in Wales. Croeso mawr I ti.
Yeah. Diolch yn fawr iawn, a diolch am wahodd fi siarad yma, Hugh. Now, without much ado, in March 1887, the Red Dragon, the national magazine for Wales, opened with its usual advertisements, among them a regular for a drych and Banner America, interesting title, the recognised, and I quote, national organ of the Welsh people of the United States. A 2-article series on what America owes to Welshmen for the formation of her government on the principles of civil and religious liberty followed, of which the second was dedicated to Richard Price. This was a joyous discovery for me, and what in my native language you call an aha moment. It was joyous because it'll enable me to resolve amicably a long-standing academic argument with the organiser of this conference, our Dean of Welsh, Dr. Hugh Williams, that Richard Price was not part of the Welsh public discourse. The eureka moment was the realisation of why and how Price's ideas echoed at last in the Welsh public discourse of the 19th century. So we shall return to this towards the end of this paper, after considering a little bit of historiography, the lack of Price reception in Wales in places where I would expect it, and his echoes in the 19th century. Now, when radical publishing and translation, one can almost say, exploded in Wales from about 1793, little reference was made to Richard Price. Thomas Paine's ideas and persona were heavily present in the public discourse, as fearful monster to be burnt by loyalist mobs and as God's instrument for millennial Baptists. His works, From Common Sense, published in 1776, Two Rights of Man 1 and 2, were patchworked into 2 Welsh language Republican pamphlets by Jack Glan-y-Gors. Joseph Priestley deeply influenced Welsh Unitarians and radicals through financial aid, correspondence and ideas. His writings were translated by Thomas Glencothi, whom he supported. In 1792-93, his good name was vigorously defended by David Jones, aka the Welsh freeholder. His teachings became part of the Welsh Unitarian credo. Dear George Washington, Washington Key, was mentioned in poetry. Benjamin Franklin's thoughts were translated into little Welsh pamphlets, and his letters reproduced in Welsh periodicals. Voltaire and Rousseau were referenced, influencing teaching and indeed landscaping here in Wales. Price's general arguments for civil and religious rights may have been present in some of the radical material, but direct echoes are scarce. How can we explain this? Next slide. Well, R.T. Jenkins, the doyen of French revolutionary historiography of Wales and the American and French revolutions, did so masterly in 1933. Next slide. So this is what R.T. Jenkins wrote in 1933. The greatest of the dissenting teachers is assumed to be Joseph Priestley, the hero of Welsh Unitarians in the days of David Davies of Castell Hywel and Thomas Glencothi. But there was a much more talented man, more eloquent and wider of appeal, namely the Welshman Richard Price. It's rather unfortunate that Price's pronouncements on the French Revolution in the last months of his life and his clash with Edmund Burke would have led to the public to associate his name with that revolution only. His truly influential work had been done long before 1789. In 1776, he published his observations on civil liberty, which not only explained the reasons for reforming the Senate, but went further, explaining that the senators were only representatives of their voters. This is a 19th century idea, and Richard Price is therefore one of the fathers of the radicalism which was to possess his own old country so entirely, half a century and more after his death. There's little sign of Price's influence, nor of the reform movement in the Wales of his age. Now, I could have stopped there, but I didn't because I didn't want to make Hugh very unhappy. If you change to the next slide. Later writers acknowledged Price and indeed David Williams as predecessors of the French Revolution, yet comments and interpretations are always kept very short. The reason was formulated by E.D. Evans when he calls Price and Williams Welshmen from home, of Wales, but not in Wales, which made him and other authors hesitant of, a nice quote, incorporating a record of their contributions in a work dealing with Wales. A good attempt at providing an explanation for this non-reception also came from Evans, who judged that Price's ideas, and I quote, were retailed mostly at second hand in Wales, because no Welsh version was published. He was closer to the mark than Gwynaf Williams, our most exciting 20th century historian, who so memorably wrote in 1983 that politics in Wales begins with the American Revolution. Sadly, not quite. Next slide. Welsh 18th century publishing, while dominated by England and translations from English, was mainly religious, dissenting or Methodist, with some almanacs and ballads thrown in for good measure. Political publishing was rare until the 1790s. We only have 2 translations of Welsh into Welsh of political sermons, taking the American side from 1776, and the translation of the Reform dialogue, Principles of Government in a Dialogue between a Scholar and a Peasant of 1783. The latter was very carefully hidden in a native folk play, an interlude, and that's why I put it up there, because the original had earned the author a celebrated court case for libel. And if Anthony Page is still here, I know Anthony knows a lot about that court case because I think he's written an article about it. Price's last public sermon on the love of our country, which famously welcomed France as completing the glorious revolution of 1688, was published in November 1789. But his main contributions to the discourse on modern governance had been delivered long before then, at a time when Wales was a deeply rural place without any centre of population with more than 6,000 inhabitants, ruled by a carapace of gently, mostly Tories, and inhabited by about 80% of the, who owned about 80% of the land, and everybody was dependent on them in a kind of semi-feudal serfdom relationship. Apart from David Davies of Castell Hywel and Iolo Morgannwg, who were born in 1745 and 1747, all the members of what I have called Generation 1789 were between 10 and 14 when Observations on Civil Liberty was published. They were all children of artisans, of weavers, of stonemasons, and so on. So it would have been very early for them to imbibe the teaching of Richard Price. Evans remarks that Price's, and I quote, ideas were propagated indirectly through the many dissenters who were in touch with Price and his regular visits to South Wales, but he didn't back that up with any elucidation or evidence. Richard Price's influence between 1776 and the end of the long revolutionary decade in Wales is elusive, at least in the public sphere, for the combination of reasons I've just mentioned. Nevertheless, and following Hugh's call, next slide, I searched my material again. The pamphlets published from 1790 and the 3 radical periodicals published in Welsh between 1793 and 1796, and some other volumes of this and other series published at the Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies, where I used to work and where Marianne still works, and we'll hear from her later. So Thomas Glencothi, who published one of the radical journals, the founder-father of Unitarianism in Wales, reproduced speeches celebrating Priestley and translated Lindsay and Franklin. Yet he didn't mention Price in his periodical once. Price doesn't even turn up in his private manuscripts, unlike Belsham, Franklin, Horntook, or Kippis. No wonder that the Price biography, which appeared as part of this University of Wales Press series, and I can see Paul is here, doesn't feature in the index even one of the names linked with the Welsh radical generation 1789. Next slide. Geraint H. Jenkins, who taught me to read and to write Welsh history in Welsh and in English, has claimed at the top there in his biography that Price almost certainly, that Iolo almost certainly knew the great man personally. During the last 3 years of his life, he died in 1791, Price took vacations at Bridgend and Southerndown, where he rode freely, visited relatives, and renewed friendships with active dissenters and radicals. Iolo also knew his nephew, George Cadogan Morgan, and we'll hear more about George in a minute, I think. The voluminous correspondence of 1,230 surviving letters Geraint co-edited only has one mention of Price, tellingly in a long letter to Lindsay, reporting on Welsh efforts and attempting to elicit support. And I quote this: "The Aryan societies of Coed y Cymer, near Merthyr, and of Aberdare have some Socinians, very intelligent men amongst them. We have other societies that exist of a very miscellaneous assemblage of all opinions, and of course tolerant and liberal. A few copies amongst these would do good. One of these societies had the father of the late Dr. Price for their pastor, and brothers and sisters of Mrs. George Morgan of Southgate and William Morgan of the Equitable Assurance Office are at present of the society and pure Unitarians, and what is more have influence. Mr. Samuel Price, I don't know, is that the uncle or the cousin? Their present minister is partial to the Unitarian doctrine." And while Geraint has demonstrated that Iolo's private republicanism expressed in unpublished manuscript effusions of the kind that the will of the people is the true and lawful sovereign, the people once, the people forever, are infused with ideas of civil and religious liberty, Iolo didn't cite Price or mention him, and the system of governance he suggests and publicly performed, and in the 1840s it leads to this, draws very clearly on his own radical reinterpretation of the Druid and the ancient Britain of his imagination. So tracing Price's influence in the Welsh 1790s discourse is a difficult undertaking. Yet, Hugh will be glad to hear, or maybe not, that I did find heavy traces of Price reception beyond the very fleeting in unexpected places. To feel contemporary echoes of Price in Wales, we need to turn to the learned loyalists who read Price, not Paine, to unacknowledged influences and to refutations. From 1790, we find references to the civil body and to civil and religious liberty and loyalist sermons and pamphlets by Anglican priests. This is partly sparked by Bishop Richard Watson's rather unfortunately ambiguous in the eyes of his loyalist peers, charged to the clergy of Llandaf, swiftly translated into Welsh, in which he stressed the reliance of civil freedom on obedience to the laws, but in the same paragraph appears to endorse the 1789 revolution. This evoked a lively discussion of the concept of that civil liberty, which would really burst the frame of this paper. So my remarks say, move over next slide. So if you bring that up, so there's lots of loyalists discussing this. So if you move to the next one. Mm-hmm. Great. The most influential and longest of these was a political tract written during the course of 1790 and published in 1791. Current scholarship has not engaged enough with it because it was loyalist, and we like to think of ourselves as radicals in Wales. Paradoxically, 19th century Wales had tried to forcefully forget the text for the opposite reason. Its title was Rhyddid, Liberty, the first Welsh language essay on the topic. It had been the result of an Eisteddfod competition organised by a now radicalised expatriate intelligentsia, and its beginning appears to endorse the French Revolution, or at least the fall of the Bastille. Its author, the Anglican priest and cultural entrepreneur Walter Davies, or Gwallt ar Mechain, and there he is with his Eisteddfod medal, was a national treasure so beloved that locks of his hair were sent out to his fans when he died in 1849, his letters and poems published in 3 fat volumes. It makes sense in Victorian Wales that this political pamphlet of 159 pages was forcibly forgotten. Next slide. Now, inspecting the pamphlet more closely, the categorization of liberty in the introduction, down to the wording, and a few citations reveal engagement with Price's observations on the nature of liberty. Next slide. But where Price is dissecting a country that's keeping others in servitude and suggesting a system of democratic representation of civil liberty, Davies delivers an extended paean to Great Britain and its empire. True liberty lies in submission to God, king, and worldly authority, even where freedom of thought and free will are in the question. Gwallt ar Mechain's Rhyddid Gwladwriaethol, which we may translate as civil liberty or political liberty, doesn't mention people as agents for the common good, nor representation. There's no time here for detail, that'll have to wait, but Price's definitions in the middle column and my translation of Gwallt ar Mechain's text on the right give you an idea on how Davies used Price's work. It's almost like Marx and Hegel, your dad would like this, turned upside down. So he uses Price's phraseology in Welsh, and he kind of turns it all around. So the majority of Rhyddid, unlike Observations, was not dedicated to civil liberty, but to the aggrandizement of Great Britain as a beacon of liberty, even though the Act of Toleration had regrettably set free a nest of, I quote, dissenting vipers. The slave trade was, of course, abhorrent, and smoking tobacco should be banned. Montesquieu, Locke, Voltaire, and Price are cited, the latter singled out for accusations of hortaidd en llib, defamatory libel, because Price had attacked the British tax system in his justice and policy of the war with America, and this is cited directly. So Gwallt ar Mechain had studied this closely. For Davies, America was still and again the enemy, and the taxes raised in the 1770s had been necessary for, and I quote, the kingdom to remain free. Gwallemechain's essay laid the foundations for further loyalist contestations of concepts of liberty, like the very interesting 1794 civil liberty guarded against abuse by the Archdeacon of Brecon. However, a longer lasting influence was exerted by his historical survey of Welsh liberty, which, like Iolo Morgannwg, connected 18th century romantic effusions on the proto-democratic Free Britons enslaved by the iron yoke of the Saxon and then the Norman, with 19th century pride and empire, the Welsh, of course, having been freed by the Tudor dynasty's Acts of Union, which gave them, or 2% of them, political representation. Now, Pitt's reign of terror silenced generation 1789. David Jones, the Welsh freeholder, turned to Anglicanism and became a barrister. Thomas Glencothi went to prison. David Davis of Holywell went to internal emigration in Ironbridge, and David Davis of Castell Howell was cowed into submission by government spies. Poetic and essay competitions in the Eisteddfod turned to Britannia's war efforts, and Iolo Morgannwg's radical gorseddau was shut down by the militia around 1797. When the Napoleonic Wars ended, a cultural renaissance used these Eisteddfodau, the gorseddau, the Druid, but it was bankrolled by gentry and industrialists and led by Anglican parsons and dissenting ministers together, who took great care to remodel generation 1789 and that whole culture into something imperial and apolitical. Price appears to have been forgotten. Yr Ymofynydd, the Unitarian periodical founded in 1848, only mentioned Price about 10 times between its foundation and 1914. Next slide. And I haven't translated this. The entries are all very much like this. Short, referencing him as a mathematician or scientist, always secondary to priestly, always mentioned with other mathematicians and with the Royal Society and so on. So there's not even the kind of whitewashed entry on him in the first dictionaries on eminent Welshmen, which come out in 1834 and 1852. And next slide. His first entry comes in 1908, and again, very whitewashed, very short. It's shorter than that of Iolo Morgannwg or Morgan John Rhys, and they're pretty short. Turning to an increasingly militant working class movement, including Chartism, which could have inherited his teachings, we find them drawing on new English authors. As to cite Gwynaf Williams again, the Welsh single democratic tradition of the Jacobin 1790s splintered under the pulverizing hammer of class formation. He did write exciting prose. This isn't quite true. Idgorn Cymru, or the Trumpet of Wales, the short-lived Chartist newspaper, mentions Llafur Payne, Payne's work and poetry, and Cobbett on savings, and reproduces translations of Volney and that reform dialogue which had been hidden in an interlude in 1783. But it did not reference Price. The Welsh had, it appears, safely filed him as expatriate Welshman, mathematician, and friend of Joseph Priestley. Not quite, though. By the second half of the 19th century, Richard's Price persona and ideas had become part of the Welsh discourse on the United States. The basis of this discourse had been the emigration of large numbers of Welsh dissenters. I mean, large numbers relative to how many people we have in Wales, let's face it, to North America from the 17th century. The social, religious, intellectual networks they developed there aided the survival of a separate national identity, as seen on the in the advertisement we saw earlier. Complete with a press, of course, with a continuing transatlantic communication with the old home and with public Welsh pride in the sons of Wales who had helped establish the world's most important modern democracy. Eminent Welsh scholars from Glanmore Williams, Bill Jones and Howell M. Davis to Jerry Hunter have engaged with these migratory movements, and I don't have to rehearse this here. Suffice to cite Evans's explanation of Welsh interest in the American Revolution, because this is what also shaped Welsh responses to 1789 and ultimately echoes of Richard Price in Wales. In his opinion, next slide, I think. Yes, in his opinion, the American Revolution evoked a great deal of interest in Wales on account of the great number of Welshmen who had emigrated to America, but still kept in touch with their native land. To many Welshmen in Wales, Pennsylvania and Delaware were a second Wales across the sea, and America was regarded as the apotheosis of freedom, a sentiment constantly reiterated in countless letters to correspondents in Wales. In the 1790s, these private sentiments spilt from those countless letters into the new political literature, furthering political migration and imperial exploration. The myth of 12th century Madoc, who discovered America, was radically reinterpreted. Poetry and prose projected dreams of equality and liberty onto this new world. Favorable descriptions and letters from emigrants were published, and at least one member of Generation 1789, Morgan John Rhys, fled persecution to this new world. We like to interpret these migration movements in terms of internal colonialism and persecution in Wales. But they were, of course, also movements of colonization. The Welsh were happy participants in possessing lands settled by indigenous inhabitants. Now, the discourse of liberty meshed with a radical reinterpretation of a Celtic prehistory, and particularly the figure of the Druid. And all these ideas of a utopian new world and Welsh migration there were fitted after the Napoleonic Wars into the discourse of Welsh contributions to modern Western civilization. It's no coincidence that the two citations and the two men chosen for the 1887 article penned by Ap Morn are Roger Williams and Richard Price. Roger Williams is celebrated first for his struggle on behalf, and can we have the next slide? Yes. For his struggle on behalf, and I quote, of the liberty of conscience, injustice towards the Indians, love of peace, and religious and civil liberty. And I'm quoting a lot here. Troubled in mind over the scriptural standing of the Church of England, he emigrated to Massachusetts in 1632, where his public opinion soon excited consternation among the rulers of the state, and he was pretty much persecuted for the remainder of his life, which included returning him to Britain, to Cromwell, Britain, at some point. His claim to fame, however, for the Welsh is that, on the one hand, he laid the foundations for religious toleration and spiritual independence in the US, and was apparently one of the first settlers who treated the Indians as friends. But on the other hand, of course, he is the founder. It's the next one, actually. We want there. On the other hand, he is the founder of Rhode Island and the city of Providence in 1636, which he had, of course, taken possession of from the Native Americans. And yes, for being remembered, it always helps to have been friends with a famous philosopher or two. In his case, that was Milton, who wrote some very flattering lines about him after his death. Now, the second article announces itself as being on Richard Price. No surprises here, it goes in the same direction. It provides the usual very short overview of Price's life and a list of his works, focusing on observations on civil liberty, on his friendships with Franklin and with Jefferson. We don't learn nearly as much as we do about his life as we learn in the article on Williams. We stay firmly in America, and the value of Price's observations is measured in its influence on is measured by the great resemblance between the form of the American government and that of the ancient Britons before Caesar's time. All accredited, of course, to the powerful advocacy of the American cause by Dr. Price. Now, I won't bore you with that whole long passage. Upmorn explains at length the essential similarities between what he calls the states of ancient Britain and the United States, alike in all essentials and guided by llais y wlad, the voice of a people, though those ancient Britons apparently had a king, and yes, the whole looks a lot like the British constitutional monarchy. His proof is, and I quote, Dr. Price's treatise that he recommended America to adopt a modified form of this ancient British government, retaining its essential elements. He goes on, and the remainder of the article is filled with extensive citations from observations on the nature of civil liberty. All is concluded with a summary of the numerous Welshmen who had made America great. From the early settlers to the signatories of the Declaration of Independence, and here's something, it's like a pack that was given to me by an international student, which explains the Welshmen, where the Welshmen are who signed the Declaration of Independence. Now, this author, Upmorn, extends the number of Welshmen to 17 members of the First Assembly, 5 presidents of the US, and very numerous American generals, who, and I quote, vindicated the renown of their ancestors, the ancient Britons. Welshmen brought with them a patriotism kindled at the altars of ancient British freedom amidst the venerated hills and mountains of Cambria. The Cymru, as a race, have claims to share in the annual celebration of Independence Day, while the liberty it has secured remains. To conclude, and I don't know, I can't see whether Hugh is happy or not with this. This mini-series constitutes a small part of a wider Welsh discourse that governed the reception of 18th century Welsh radicalism in the 19th century. Whether that radicalism was enacted abroad, as in the case of Richard Price, or at home, as in the case of my lost generation, 1789. All were dovetailed into a depoliticized discourse on an ancient Celtic civilization that laid the foundations for modern democracies in Europe and for the extension of that Western civilization to the remainder of the world by colonization. In the case of Dr. Richard Price, the observations on civil liberty derived from British political ancient wisdom became the basis of the by then entirely respectable US democracy. Thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr, Marion. Fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. And perhaps go some way to explaining the answer to the question we were asking last night around the remembering of Richard Price, or the forgetting of Richard Price. Yeah, a couple of claps up there on the screen. So we're getting towards coffee time, so I'd like to prioritise any questions that come from our virtual audience, because obviously we have Marion's company here in Cardiff and we can put some questions to her over coffee or tea perhaps. So just want to ask, first of all, are there any questions from our virtual guests for Marion? No hands are being put up there. Question from the floor at all? Marianne, if you don't mind me passing the microphone to you. Oh, Remy. Okay, we'll go to Remy and Marianne can ask the question. Lovely. Okay. Yes, Remy, please do come in.
Hi, thank you, Marion, for this really important talk. I think you said that the reception of price might be part of a wider discourse about Welsh Democrats or radicals in the 19th century, but I wonder if that's not part of a general discourse on price's reception worldwide in the 19th century. It is my feeling that price was largely ignored and sidelined through the 19th century, and that he was rediscovered fairly recently in the 60s and 70s, perhaps. So it may well be that because Price was Edmund Burke's bête noire in the reflections, that and because the loyalists eventually won the ideological battle, then Price was seen as a kind of perhaps a defeated idealist. So it would be interesting to compare Price's reputation in 19th century Wales with his reputation abroad in other countries. I think we might find similarities. That's just one suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Norman Davies has written, history is always the history of the victors, and Edmund Burke kind of, you know, he just outlived Price, you know. But I think it'd be very interesting to compare, but I think we need to make a little, differentiate between like hegemonic nations and hegemonic discourses and subaltern discourses. I think in the case of Wales, the additional factor is that Welsh Victorians are very, very desperate to be seen as respectable contributors to empire. And you know, what they're basically saying is we may have a different culture, we may have a different language, but we are still good Protestants. We still, you know, we fight in your armies, we contribute to empire building. And those Chartists are not really, that's not really our culture. And so that means that all those radical cultural institutions that were founded are being depoliticized, and all that generation, and I've just written a chapter on that lost generation, 1789, they're all whitewashed into bards, teachers, preachers, and translators. And it's also stressed that, you know, how well they knew English as well, even though they were writing in Welsh. So we have a kind of multi-layered kind of process of forgetting there.
Lovely. Diolch yn fawr, Marion. That's a really interesting response, and also I think reminds me of some of Iwan Morris's comments earlier in the year when he was discussing Price and the way in which we remember, and he certainly thought that the Victorian culture of Wales had a lot to do with the reception or the forgetting of Price in the 19th century.
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, well, if you don't mind joining me in thanking Marion for a really interesting and fascinating talk. Diolch yn fawr iawn.